今、警察官がキャンパスの中に入っていきます。沿道にいる学生からはウイングの声が上がっています。午後9時です。大学のゲートが開き、警察官が一斉に大学の中へ入っていきます。学生を拘束するためでしょうか、手錠のようなものも持っています。
The people united will never be defeated.
Let's go, let's go, let's go, don't stop! You guys gotta back up and go that way. Follow DCPI. You gotta go follow DCPI. Everybody go. Let's go.
Well, it's the biggest movement, student movement in the United States in the 21st century. It spread very quickly to almost 100 campuses. There's been over 2,000 arrests. There had been, in this century, just the Occupy movement, which is more off-campus, Occupy Wall Street. And then there had been the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protest against racism. But those were, they had campus components to it, but there was more off-campus. From Le Monde from Paris, and this morning there's someone from Barcelona. So, and I've been on German TV and Canadian, French Canadian. So there's a lot of, I mean, I think that's good that people, because you know the movement has also spread to presidents of the university, politicians, all those things interact. So it's kind of complicated to understand.
How big is this movement in the history of U.S. protest?
This is the first real mass movement on the 21st century that's on campus. So it's bigger than anything that came before, and you could say it's the biggest in the 21st century. But relative to what happened at the end of the Vietnam era, like in May 1970, the high point of student protest, it's relatively small, it's moderate in its tactics, not violent, and it's basically not as widespread in terms of not only the number of campuses, but in the percentage of students that are involved in it. Like here at NYU, we had about 200 students in the encampment, but we have 30,000 students here on the campus.
Why did it spread so much and why do it?
And then it was suppressed with the mass police invasion at Columbia and other places like NYU. And that in turn was very dramatic. It raised awareness of it. And also the other piece of it, which was not present in the 20th century, was social media. That the news about what's happening in Gaza, plus the news about these protests, spread very quickly. So, like I'd compare this movement in its size to the anti-apartheid divestment movement of the 1980s, which also began at Columbia. That spread, but it didn't spread as quickly, because you could look at it on TV. You had to go home and watch it on TV. Place, right? And the kind of fury that you had back then, with the war being escalated in '65 until '70, that's 5 years of people feeling frustrated about the war. And remember back then, you could be drafted, right? So it was a much more personal, you know, the U.S. is supporting the Israelis through military aid, so that's similar, right? That you're concerned about U.S. policy and use of military force, but it's much less, you know, and also remember too, there's some opposition now, because there are students who are pro-Israel. They're not as big, you know, the bigger protests, but they're, and in fact, at UCLA, there was some violent confrontation between the two. So. But they did have political pressure, because earlier in the semester, the president of Harvard and MIT and Penn were called before a congressional committee led by conservatives who caricature this anti-war movement as being pro-Hamas, hateful, you know, that anti-Semitic. So basically, they're telling the president of Harvard, you guys, do you tolerate anti-Semitism by letting these protests go? And the president was kind of inarticulate. So what happened is pressure from Congress and the donors, give money to these private universities, said, we don't want you anymore. And they pressured her out of office, both Penn and Harvard. So remember, in the United States there's a pecking order. Like the most prestigious university, sort of like the University of Tokyo, right? The university that's most prestigious, what happens to the president of Harvard has ripple effects. So if you're a president of Columbia and you don't want to lose your job, you're thinking, I better like not give too much breathing room to this unpopular movement. So that would incline you to say, we're not going to tolerate this, and to call in the police, which is what they did. But that backfired, because then the students came back again and they had to give further suspensions, right? That leads to escalation, and the escalation then led to the takeover of Hamilton Hall. Well, the big problem is, why are they outside protesting? Why are there all these demonstrations? Well, the issue is that on campuses, students don't have a vote in policy. They don't vote for the president. They don't set the policy of the universities on investment, because one of the demands is about divesting from Israel, but they don't have a voice in that. And so essentially, all they can do is make noise, right, to try to call people's attention to it. And so what I'm saying is the protests are a kind of symptom of a lack of democratic governance and inclusion in university governance. So I would hope that coming out of this will be some internal recognition of the need to change that. Like one of the reforms that happened at some state universities, like the University of California and others, after the 60s and the 70s, they didn't want to have this like disconnect with the students again, and so they actually at least put one student on the board of trustees. Well, I think it will have an impact because President Biden, to defeat Donald Trump in 2020, was one of the main constituency was the youth vote, right? So he doesn't want to lose young people. They see images of dead children. It's very, very upsetting. So that can potentially disrupt his support from young people. But you have to be careful. Remember, that's only a minority on campus involved in the movement. When you think about youth in general, the polls show Gaza is not near the top. Like inflation, other issues are more important. So it's not going to affect the majority of young people, but even if it affects a minority of young people, because such a close election, that can come back to haunt them. They'd be worried about it because it's very close. The polling is very close. The other piece of it is, over the summer, there are the presidential conventions, and the Democrats won in Chicago, and people are worried. They're comparing this to what happened during the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968, which there was basically like a police riot against the anti-war protesters. If the Chicago Convention has another bunch of violence happen, it could really hurt Biden's presidential candidacy. But I think you have to be careful that, in the sense that history doesn't repeat itself directly, and what helped to cause the violence in '68 was a very repressive anti-movement mayor, Richard Daley, was the political boss of Chicago, and the police were very hostile to the movement, and the movement had been in a kind of angry mood because of the fact that the war kept escalating. There's not a reactionary mayor. The police are not, I don't think, furious at the student movement, which is relatively new, and the students themselves have no real experience being violent. So there could be protests there that are nonviolent, and they likely would be nonviolent. So I don't think you're going to see history repeat itself the same exact way.
If the administration sees that we are united,
always unpopular. Even if the cause looks like it's great, like fighting racism or championing free speech. And why is that? Part of it is about the cultural conservatism of the society that feels that students should obey the rules, study hard, not make waves. And I think this expression I think I use a lot is that when a basketball player, football player takes a political position, you say, shut up and play. If a student does that, shut up and study. And to me, that's really not the best way to deal with. You should take students seriously and listen, and not start off with a bias against them, thinking, always think the worst about them, or there's some outside agitator, that's funding them. Because that's just, basically after being arrested for a sit-in. And the woman who's looking straight ahead out there in this picture is Marion Wright Edelman, who later on was close to Martin Luther King. She came up with the idea of the Poor People's Campaign in '68, and she also later on...
ニュースディグ